Cuba resists new sanctions from the United States. Cuba finds itself under geopolitical fire. Marco Rubio announces more sanctions for the island. Cuba resists a new wave of sanctions imposed by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who announced a tightening of US policy toward the island. This new economic attack seeks to further strangle the Caribbean nation, but the Cuban people, steadfast and determined, continue to face these measures with resilience and determination. The recent sanctions are part of an aggressive strategy to weaken the Cuban government, keeping it on the list of state sponsors of terrorism and reactivating Title III of the Liberty Act. The latter allows US citizens to file lawsuits against those who use properties that were nationalized by the Cuban Revolution. This action not only reinforces the economic embargo, but also seeks to limit Cuba's trade relations with the rest of the world and restrict the island's access to international financing. For more than 6 decades, the Cuban people have been victims of a policy of economic suffocation imposed by Washington, a strategy that has proven ineffective in its goal of breaking the island's sovereignty. Marco Rubio, in his speech, justified the sanctions by stating that the Cuban government supports acts of international terrorism, an accusation that lacks solid foundations and that has been rejected by numerous international organizations. However, this narrative has been repeatedly used by different US administrations to justify coercive measures that directly affect the civilian population. In response, the Cuban government has condemned these new sanctions, calling them another desperate attempt by Washington to undermine the country's stability. Meanwhile, the population continues to show its unwavering spirit, finding new ways to overcome difficulties and maintain their quality of life despite US efforts to isolate them economically. The resistance of the Cuban people is not only an act of survival, but also a demonstration of the firmness with which the island defends its sovereignty and its right to decide its own destiny. One of the key points of the new sanctions is the reinstatement of restrictions against entities operating within the Cuban economy. Companies linked to tourism, trade and finance have been included again on the restricted list, which will make it even more difficult for foreign currency to enter the country. However, experience has shown that the Cuban people have been able to adapt and resist every economic onslaught imposed by Washington, developing self-management mechanisms and strengthening its trade relations with strategic allies. Another important aspect of the announced measures is the inclusion of the remittance processing company Orbit SA on the list of sanctioned entities. This company was created to guarantee the arrival of remittances from abroad after the sanction imposed on Fintimex, another Cuban financial institution. With this new restriction, the US administration is trying to hit one of the main channels for money entering the island, directly affecting families who depend on these transfers for their daily sustenance. However, Cuba has found ways to maintain the flow of remittances through alternatives that avoid Washington's control. The tightening of the embargo and sanctions seeks not only to damage the Cuban economy, but also to generate discontent among the population. However, the people of Cuba have shown throughout history that they are not easily intimidated. Far from weakening the morale of the citizens, these actions have served to reinforce the sense of unity and resistance, making the fight against the embargo stronger than ever. Solidarity among Cubans and the support of allied nations have been essential to mitigate the effects of these sanctions. The impact of these sanctions could extend to other sectors of the economy, including tourism, one of the country's main sources of income. However, Cuba has been exploring new ways to diversify its economy and strengthen its relations with countries that do not comply with the US sanctions policy. The Caribbean nation has increased its trade ties with strategic partners such as China, Russia, and Latin American nations, seeking to reduce its dependence on the US dollar and promote the use of alternative currencies in international trade. This strategy has allowed Cuba to maintain some leeway in the face of Washington's aggressive sanctions policy. Despite the belligerent rhetoric of Marco Rubio and the US administration, Cuba remains firm on its path towards economic and political independence. The international community has repeatedly expressed its rejection of the economic embargo, calling it an inhumane and unjustified measure that only seeks to generate suffering in the Cuban population. Even within the United States, critical voices have questioned the effectiveness of these sanctions and have called for a review of policy toward the island. Numerous countries have expressed their solidarity with Cuba in international forums, denouncing the impact of the sanctions on the Cuban people and demanding their lifting. The Cuban people have resisted the attacks of the White House for more than 60 years, demonstrating a strength and dignity that have been recognized worldwide. Every new sanction imposed by Washington is met with creativity, unity, and the determination to move forward without giving up. This new battery of sanctions will be no exception. Despite attempts by the United States to undermine its sovereignty, Cuba continues on its path with its head held high, reaffirming its commitment to a future based on self-determination and social justice. The measures announced by Marco Rubio only demonstrate Washington's desperation at the resistance of the Cuban people. However, far from achieving their goal of surrender, these sanctions have reinforced the conviction that Cuba will not give in to external pressure. History has shown that no attempt at economic strangulation has succeeded in breaking the will of a people fighting for their dignity and sovereignty. Despite the challenges, Cuba continues to build its future with determination, consolidating its position on the international stage and reaffirming its resistance to foreign interference. As the United States tightens the noose with sanctions, Cuba seeks new horizons of support and growth. This is where BRICS comes in, a coalition of powerful emerging economies that includes Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. This alliance offers Cuba a lifeline, an opportunity to resist external pressure and forge a path toward economic resilience. Joining forces with BRICS promises to open up new opportunities for the island nation. Through shared investments, trade agreements, and technology exchanges, Cuba seeks to strengthen its economy and improve its global standing. Cuba's participation in BRICS symbolizes a new chapter of resistance and solidarity. It reflects the island's unwavering determination to seek allies who respect its sovereignty and support its vision of social justice and self-determination. The road ahead is full of challenges and promises, but Cuba is ready to embrace this new chapter with courage and optimism.